I remembered the first time I heard the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the kind that comes after it. When something so vast and fundamental has been said or done that all the noise in the world cannot fill the void it leaves behind. I was a remembrancer once, an Iterator, to use the formal title. My purpose was to witness, to chronicle, to shape the narrative of a galaxy being remade. I followed the expeditionary fleets, my stylus and pictor, my only weapons, my truth, my only shield. I believed, with the fervent stupidity of the privileged and the educated, that I was capturing history. I was wrong. I was merely collecting the dust that settled in the wake of a god's passing. They called it the Great Crusade, a title that tastes of ash in my mouth now. It was not a crusade. A crusade implies a holy war, a fight for something sacred. This was something else. This was a reclamation so absolute, so violently insistent, that it bordered on erasure. We did not bring enlightenment to the lost colonies of humanity. We brought a choice, presented on the edge of a monomolecular blade, compliance or oblivion. There was no third option. There never is when you deal in absolutes. And he was the absolute. I never saw him directly, not in the flesh, if such a term could ever apply to him. To see him was to go blind or mad, or worse, to become so incandescently devoted that your own mind ceased to be your own. I saw his shadow. I felt the tremors of his will. I witnessed the aftermath, the perfect, sterilized order that bloomed in the bloody footprints of his Legiones Astartes. My first assignment was with the 148th Expeditionary Fleet, attached to the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines. They were the ideal, or so we were told. The template of what the crusade was meant to be. Disciplined, efficient, logical. They fought with a terrifying, machine-like precision. They would descend upon a world, a blue and chrome avalanche, and within solar days, sometimes hours, the resistance would be quantified, isolated, and eliminated. Then would come the iterators, the logisticians, the civitas adepts. We would walk onto a world still warm from the battle, the air thick with the ozone stench of loss fire and the coppery temps of blood, and we would begin the work of telling the survivors why what had just happened to them was not only necessary, but good. I remember a world called Galaspar, a high-gravity rock, its people hardened by centuries of struggle against the crushing weight of their own planet. They had deviated, of course. All lost human colonies had. They worshipped a machine that slumbered in their world's core, a relic of the Dark Age. They were not hostile. They were insular, suspicious, clinging to their old ways with the stubbornness of those who have survived only by refusing to change. The Ultramarines gave them the compliance. It was a textbook operation. The first captain, himself a giant of cold nobility named Marius Gage, delivered the ultimatum from orbit. The Galasparans, foolishly brave, refused. The orbital bombardment began not on cities, but on their sacred sites, the great geothermal vents where they communed with their sleeping god machine. They watched their temples melt into slag. Then the Stormbirds descended. I was in a command skimmer, observing from a safe ridge. I saw the blue giants move through the Galasparan defensive lines. They did not run. They advanced, a wall of ceramite and implacable force. Galasparan kinetic rounds sparked off their armor. Their return fire was a single, synchronized storm of bolter shells that didn't just kill men. It erased whole sections of the line in bursts of red mist and shattered stone. It was not a battle. It was a demonstration, a lesson in applied, overwhelming force. Within 6 hours, the planetary governance, surrendered. I was part of the team that went to the capital, a city carved into a deep chasm. The people watched us from their doorways, their eyes not filled with hatred, but with a hollow, exhausted confusion. Their world had ended, and the architects of that end were now walking their streets. Speaking of unity and a glorious future, my job was to interview the surviving members of the Galasparan Council. Their leader, an old woman with skin like weathered leather and eyes that held the weight of her world's gravity, looked at my recording device, then at me. "You are here to write down our story," she said, her voice a dry rustle. "I am here to ensure the truth of your compliance is recorded for the Imperial archives." I replied, the official words tasting like dust. She smiled then, a thin, cracked smile that held no warmth. "There is no our story anymore. There is only yours. You have not conquered us. You have replaced us. You will write your truth over our bones, and in a generation, even the memory of what we were will be a curiosity, a footnote in your great epic." She leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Tell me, scribe of the stars, when your emperor has unified every human soul under his banner, when there is no one left to contradict his story, what will you do? Who will you be when there is no other to define yourselves against?" I had no answer. I recorded her statement, her defiance, her surrender. I filed it away. The official report I wrote spoke of a smooth compliance, of a backward people gratefully accepting the light of the Imperial Truth. Her words, her prophecy, I kept to myself. They became the first crack in my own certainty. That was the pattern. World after world, compliance after compliance. I saw the wolves of Fenris howl into the night as they broke a culture of psychic moon worshippers, leaving not a single soul alive. I saw the Iron Hands reduce a continent of rebellious forge cities to molten glass, their logic as cold and unforgiving as their steel. I saw the Emperor's children, in their early days of glory, attempt to bring a world to compliance through art and oration, only for the frustration at its failure to curdle into a brutal aestheticized violence that was somehow worse than the straightforward slaughter of other legions. And through it all, the silence grew. The silence of a question never asked, of a doubt never voiced. We were building an empire, a united humanity, a future free of the horrors of old night. Why, then, did it feel so much like we were simply becoming the new horror? We had exchanged the chaos of Xenos and warp storms for the sterile, ordered tyranny of a single, unchallengeable will. I began to look for him, not in the grand announcements or the victory musters, but in the margins, in the things unsaid. I studied the few, heavily sanitized histories of the unification of Terra. They spoke of the Thunder Warriors, the proto-legions that conquered Earth. They were hailed as heroes, the strong right arm of the Emperor, but the records of their fate were vague. They vanished from history after the last battle at Mount Ararat, replaced by the newer, better, more stable Adeptus Astartes. "A necessary upgrade," the Iterators whispered. I wondered, with a cold feeling in my gut, what happens to a tool once it has served its purpose? I saw his shadow in the way the Mechanicus of Mars venerated him not as a man, but as the Omnissiah, the machine god incarnate, a convenient theological merger that gave him the forges of the Red Planet. I saw his shadow in the librarians, the psychers within the legions, who wielded the very powers the Imperial Truth declared did not exist, or were mere psychic phenomena, a contradiction that was ignored for the tactical advantage it provided. The most profound silence surrounded the Primarchs, these 20 demigods, his sons, scattered across the galaxy by forces unknown, only to be miraculously rediscovered just in time to lead his crusade. It was a perfect myth, almost too perfect. Each one an archetype, a facet of the human condition amplified to superhuman scale. The statesman, the warrior, the artisan, the philosopher, the monster. I met a few in distant glimpses. Robert Gilliman of the Ultramarines, a mind of such staggering administrative and strategic capacity. He seemed less a being and more a force of nature channeled through a bipedal form. His certainty was a physical pressure in the room. Lemon Russ of the Space Wolves, a roaring, living engine of destruction wrapped in the skin of a barbarian king, whose cunning was always masked by the performance of savagery. But it was the silence around the two lost ones that spoke loudest. The 2 and the 11th Primarchs, expunged, not just killed, but deleted. Their names scraped from every record, their legions disbanded and absorbed, their very existence deemed so toxic that memory itself had to be sterilized. What do you do? What crime do you commit that your own father, a godlike being, does not just kill you, but unmakes you from history? That silence was a scream. My own crisis came on a world whose name is also now dust to me. It was a late compliance, a mineral-rich asteroid belt colonized by humans who had merged with alien technology, becoming something other. They were not hostile, they were different. And difference, in the eyes of the Crusade, was the only heresy that mattered. The order came from the Fleet Command. Total purgation. The xenotech was an existential contamination. The human population, irrevocably altered, was to be removed. I was ordered to the flagship to witness the final orbital bombardment, to record the decisive closing of this compliance action. I stood on the observation deck, a vast pane of armor-plates showing the glittering field of asteroids below. The fleet's lances powered up, casting a cold, dead light on the deck. I had my picture ready. I was to capture the moment of cleansing. But as I looked down at those spinning rocks, those tiny fragile habitats where beings human in origin, if not in current form, lived, worked, dreamed, and feared, I saw not a strategic target. I saw Galaspa. I saw 100 other worlds. I saw the old woman's face. Who will you be when there is no other to define yourselves against? The silence in my head became deafening. It was the silence of a galaxy being scoured of every deviation, every flaw, every unique and beautiful and terrible mistake. It was the silence of a single, monotonous truth being imposed on an infinite, chaotic, wonderful universe. It was the silence of a father demanding absolute obedience from his children and brooking no dissent. I lowered my picture. I did not record the land strikes that turned the asteroid habitats into clouds of expanding gas and molten slag. I stood there in the middle of that bustling command deck, surrounded by the focused intensity of the Crusade's servants, and I felt utterly, completely alone. The Imperial Truth was a lie. The Great Crusade was not a reunion. It was an annexation, and he was not a savior. He was the greatest tyrant the galaxy had ever known. Because his tyranny was disguised as salvation, he offered not chains, but purpose. Not subjugation, but unity. And in doing so, he asked us to surrender the most human thing of all, our right to be wrong, to be different, to be flawed, to choose our own damnation. I left the observation deck. I never filed a report. In the coming days, I requested a transfer, citing psychological fatigue from prolonged frontline duty. My superiors, with the clinical empathy of the truly devoted, agreed. I was reassigned to a quiet bureaucratic post in a backwater sector, compiling casualty reports and resource manifests. A fitting end for a failed Iterator. I thought I had escaped. I thought my quiet rebellion, my internal rejection, was enough. I was a fool. The heresy did not surprise me. When the news first trickled in whispers of betrayal at Istvan, of legions turning against the throne, of the War Master Horus himself crying out for rebellion, I felt not horror, but a grim, sickening vindication. The silence had been broken. The Absolute had finally created its own equal and opposite reaction. The Father's perfect plan had been shattered by the very sons he created to enact it. But in the breaking, something worse was born. In rejecting one absolute tyranny, Horus embraced another, far more ancient and foul. The chaos he unleashed was not freedom. It was the mirror image of the Imperial Truth's another singular, consuming narrative, this one of rage, excess, decay, and scheming. The choice was not between tyranny and freedom. It was between the tyranny of order and the tyranny of entropy, between a silent, sterile galaxy and a screaming, cancerous one. I sit now in my tiny hub unit, on a world that has not yet felt the fire of either side. The astropathic choirs are in disarray, the news fragmented and terrible. I hear of terror besieged, of the emperor facing his son in the heart of his palace, and I think of that old woman on Gala Spa. She was right. There is no our story anymore. There are only two stories, crashing against each other like tectonic plates, grinding everything between them to dust. One story writes itself in cold, unwavering light. The other in the shifting, hungry hues of the warp, and caught between them. Forgotten by both are the Galaspars, the silent asteroid miners, the billions upon billions of ordinary souls who never asked for gods or primarchs or crusades. They only wanted to live, but that is the one thing the galaxy in its grim darkness will never allow. Not anymore. The silence is gone. Now there is only the roar. I tried to bury myself in the minutiae of my new posting. The subsector governorate of Valkyria Secundus was a monument to bureaucratic inertia. Its concerns were petty. Grain yields from agri-worlds falling 0.3% below projections. Minor schisms in the local ecclesiarchy cults, though the Imperial Truth still officially forbade worship. It sprouted in 1,000 forms anyway. Piracy reports that were likely just smugglers avoiding tariffs. I compiled reports on promethium consumption for patrol flotillas that probably hadn't left their orbital docks in decades. It was soul-crushing, and I welcomed the crushing. It was a penance for my failure of conviction, a life sentence of quiet irrelevance. But the war has a way of finding even the most hidden corners. It doesn't come with crashing bulk landers and screaming chain blades. It comes in whispers. It comes in the data dash stream. It started with the logistical reports, discrepancies, worlds on the edge of the Valkyria sector, ones that should have been shipping men and material to the supposed front lines. Of the Crusade, though, where those lines were now, no one could truly say we're going silent. Not in the dramatic, astropathic scream of a world dying, but in the administrative silence of missed tithes, unanswered hails, and cancelled supply runs. The official bulletins from the Segmentum capital spoke of temporary warp disturbances and reprioritization of strategic assets, but in the raw data, a pattern emerged. The silence was spreading inward, like a stain soaking through a map. Then came the people. Refugees, though that word was forbidden. They were displaced loyalists, evacuated assets. They came on battered, leaking merchant vessels, their hulls scarred by weapons fire that didn't match any Xenos signature on record. They spoke in hushed tones in the lower hive sinkholes where they were quartered. I, the forgotten Iterator, still had some small skill at listening. I traded my rations for information, my anonymity for confidences. They spoke of fleets fighting fleets in the void, of Astartes killing us. This wasn't the clean, surgical removal of non-compliance. This was butchery. They spoke of the World Eaters, their blue and white armor now stained eternally crimson, falling upon loyal Imperial Army regiments, not with strategy, but with a frenzied animal hunger. They spoke of the Death Guard, who had become something resilient and foul, their very presence poisoning the air. They spoke of the Emperor's children, whose pursuit of perfection had curdled into something unspeakable, a sensory madness that flayed souls alongside skin. But most of all, they spoke of the War Master, Horus, the beloved sun, the brightest star in the Imperial firmament. His betrayal was the central, unshakable trauma. It was a personal wound for every soul who had believed in the Crusade's promise. If Horus could fall, what hope was there? The foundation of the entire Imperium wasn't law or truth or justice. It was faith in the Emperor's plan, embodied in his sons. That faith was now shattered, and the cracks were racing through every heart and every world. I listened, and the cold vindication I'd first felt curdled into a deep, numb horror. I had seen the tyranny of order. These broken souls described the chaos of rebellion. Neither was a victory. It was a choice between the fire and the flood, and both would drown you in the end. My bureaucratic isolation ended the day the subsector governor, a bloated man named Prefectus Hull, summoned his department heads. His face, usually polished with smug assurance, was the color of old cheese. The news had finally, officially arrived. A priority astropathic burst, so heavily encrypted it had taken days to unravel. Horus Lupercal had turned traitor, he and several of his brother Primarchs with him. They had massacred loyal forces at Istvan. They were marching on Terra. The Imperium was in a state of civil war. All loyal servants were to fortify their positions, secure their resources, and prepare for potential ... instability. The room erupted in a cacophony of panic, denial, and frantic planning. I just stood there, leaning against the wall. I watched them. The strategic minds began arguing over defensible positions and fleet allocations. The logisticians wept over their interrupted supply chains. The ideologues trembled, their entire worldview evaporating. Prefectus Hull kept screaming for quiet, for order, his voice cracking. In that moment, I saw the entire Great Crusade in microcosm, a fragile, top-heavy structure built on unquestioning belief. Now that the central pillar of that belief had been kicked away, it wasn't just an army rebelling. It was a story unwriting itself. The Imperial Truth was a narrative we had all been telling ourselves, and the main character had just ripped the pages in half. Asterisk, I didn't wait for the meeting to end. I walked out. I went back to my tiny, data-cluttered office. I looked at the reports on my Slather Prometheum levels, the grain yields, the pirate sightings. It was all nonsense. The intricate, pointless clockwork of a machine that was already broken. I had a decision to make. I could stay. I could throw myself into the frenzy of fortifying Valkyria, Secundus, become a tiny cog in the loyalist resistance. I could try to believe again, to find purpose in the fight against the traitors. But I had seen the face of that fight in the refugees' eyes. It was not noble. It was a meat grinder. The loyalists would be just as brutal, just as desperate. The ultramarines I had once admired would now fight with the cold fury of the betrayed. The space wolves would become even more savage. There would be no heroes in this war, only survivors and perpetrators. The other option was to run, to try and vanish into the vastness of a galaxy now doubly dangerous. But run where? There was no outside anymore. The war was everywhere. The choice was not between war and peace. It was between which version of the hell you would die in. I did not choose. Choice implies agency, and I felt I had none. Instead, I was acted upon. Fate, or perhaps simple cruel coincidence, chose for me. 2 days after the announcement, a ship translated into the system. It was not a Grand Legion warship, nor a bulk hauler. It was a sleek, predatory thing. A Cobra-class destroyer with its transponder broadcasting a confused, looping series of old Imperial and Rogue trader codes. It bore no Legion markings, but its hull was painted a deep, bruised purple and edged in gold that seemed to ache the eye. It demanded, not requested. Demanded immediate resupply and the transfer of all tactical data on the sector. Prefectus Hull, desperate to prove his loyalty and avoid destruction, complied immediately. He ordered a team, a mix of naval liaison officers and bureaucratic factotums, to go aboard and facilitate the transfer. My name, thanks to my pointless familiarity with sector resource reports, was on the list. We took a shuttle over. The moment the boarding ramp sealed behind us, I knew we had made a terrible mistake. The air inside was thick, warm, and perfumed with something cloying and exotic that scratched at the back of the throat. The lighting was subtly wrong, casting deep, velvety shadows that seemed to move at the edge of vision. The crew that greeted us were humans, technically. They wore modified Imperial Navy uniforms, but the cuts were too sharp, the fabrics too rich. Their faces were pale, their eyes too bright, their smiles containing too many teeth. They moved with a languid, predatory grace. We were led to the bridge, not a meeting room. The captain stood with his back to us, gazing at the viewport. He was tall, willowy, draped in robes of iridescent scale silk. He turned slowly. He was not but he was no longer just a man. His features were achingly, impossibly symmetrical, yet utterly cold. His eyes were the color of amethyst, and they held no warmth, only a deep, calculating hunger. This was a creature of the new powers, a disciple of the Primarch I had heard the refugees whisper about with particular dread. "Fulgrim, welcome," the captain said, his voice a smooth, melodic baritone that resonated in the bones. "You bring us the keys to your little cupboard. How generous," he gestured. And a servitor, horrifically altered thing with too many data spikes and weeping. Organic connectors lumbered forward to take the data slates from our trembling hands. One of the naval officers, a young man still clinging to protocol, stammered, "By the authority of the Imperium of Man, we expect full cooperation." Under the captain moved. It was a blur. One moment he was 3 meters away, the next he was in front of the officer, a long, elegant finger under the man's chin. "The Imperium of Man," the captain whispered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Which one, little mortal? The rotting corpse on the throne, or the glorious, ascending star of the War Master? Your authority is a ghost, a memory. We are the future. He leaned closer, inhaling the officer's terror like a fine scent. And the future is not a negotiation. It is an experience. What happened next? I have tried to forget. The language fails. It was not an execution. It was a performance. A symphony of pain orchestrated with a surgeon's precision and an artist's flair. The officer did not just die. He was unraveled, his fear and agony made into a transient, terrible art for the pleasure of the captain and his crew. They watched, enraptured, making appreciative comments. I vomited. I fell to my knees, the cloying perfume now, the smell of opened viscera and ozone. The other members of my team were screaming, begging, or had gone catatonic. The captain finished, wiping a single immaculate finger on a silk cloth. He looked at the rest of us, his gaze passing over me like I was a stain on the deck. Take them to the hold. They may yet provide some diversion, or perhaps feeds. The surgeons are always complaining about the lack of fresh material. We were dragged away. I was not brave. I did not fight. I was a sack of numb terror. The hold was not a brig. It was a gallery of horrors. Cells lined with sound-absorbent moss held broken things that had once been people. Others were workshops where beings in blood-stained aprons worked on living canvases, their tools humming and slicing. The air thrummed with suppressed screams and the scent of antiseptic and decay. I was thrown into a small, dark alcove, separated from the main chamber by a force field that buzzed with a low, headache-inducing frequency. Here, I finally met the other kind of refugee. Not the lucky ones who had escaped to the unlucky ones. The captured, there was a woman, her eyes wide with a permanent, silent scream, her vocal cords removed with artistic care. A man who shivered constantly, his nervous system seemingly rewired to experience perpetual, low-grade agony. And in the corner, curled into a ball, was an Astartes. He was a shell. His power armor, once proud, was a battered, defiled relic of a dark blue and gold. The iconography of the Third Legion, the Emperor's children, scratched and gouged, overlaid with obscene new sigils. One of his arms ended at the elbow in a mess of scar tissue and crude cybernetics. He was unmoving, but his breathing was a ragged, wet sound. Days bled together in that buzzing, perfumed hell. Food was a nutrient slop shoved through the field. The captors would come sometimes, pick one of us, and take them away. They never came back. The silent woman went first, then the shivering man. Each time, the Astartes in the corner would flinch. A full-body spasm of what I realized was not fear, but shame. Finally, it was just him and me. The silence between us was different from all the others I had known. It was the silence of shared damnation, of the absolute end of the road. I found my voice, a raspy, broken thing. "Why?" I croaked at the dark blue heap. "Why did you do it? Why follow him? Why become this?" For a long time, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then, a voice like grinding stones emerged from the corner. "You think we chose this?" He didn't move. "You think we woke up one day and said, 'Let us become monsters'?" A bitter, hacking sound that might have been a laugh. It was a slope. A beautiful, gilded slope. We were the best. The perfect. He told us to seek perfection. In art, in war, in sensation, and we did. We went further than anyone. We had his blessing, then. The sensation dulled. The art became repetitive. The perfection, elusive. We needed more. sharper sensations, new arts he showed us. He opened the door. He finally turned his head. His face was a ruin of scars, but his eyes were the worst part. They were horribly, tragically clear. There was no chaos in them. There was the full, horrific understanding of what he had become. "We didn't fall," he whispered, blood-flecked sputum on his lips. "We achieved. We climbed to the very pinnacle of what our father's philosophy could offer. And when we got there, we found nothing, an emptiness so vast it screamed. And the only thing that could fill it, the only thing left that could make us feel, was this." He gestured weakly at the hell beyond our cell. "He didn't betray us. We betrayed ourselves by following his path to its logical, absolute end." In that moment, I understood everything. The Emperor, in his ruthless, absolute pursuit of a unified, rational, controlled future, had created tools of such purity and power that they could only define themselves through extremes. Horus, the ultimate commander, faced with the infinite, could only see the ultimate challenge to his father's authority. Fulgrim, the seeker of perfection, could only find completion in absolute degradation. They were not corrupted by external evil. They were unmade by the internal contradiction of their own creation. They were the children of an absolute, and when that absolute was challenged, they had nowhere to go but into another, darker absolute dot. The captain came for me that night. He stood outside the field, his head tilted. "The scribe," he mused, "the one who watches but does not act, the chronicler of other people's truths. What shall we make of you? A living book? Your skin would make such interesting parchment." But as he reached for the field controls, the Astartes in the corner moved. With a speed that belied his broken state, he lunged, not at the captain, but at the field generator conduit beside our cell. He slammed his fist, his last remaining weapon, into it. A shower of sparks, a scream of tearing metal, and the field died with a pathetic pop. The captain sighed, as if annoyed by a pet's misbehavior. He drew an elegant, crystalline blade. The Astartes, unarmed, broken, stood between him and me. He looked at me over his ruined shoulder, those terribly clear eyes meeting mine for one final second. "Tell someone," he grated. "If you get out, tell them it wasn't about gods or chaos. It was about a father who asked for everything and sons who had nothing else to give." Then he charged. It was not a heroic last stand. It was a short, brutal exchange of violence. The captain's blade slid through the Astartes' damaged chestplate with a sound like tearing silk. The giant fell, crashing to the deck. But in falling, he grabbed the captain's leg, pulling him off balance. I didn't think, I ran. I scrambled past the struggling figures, down the corridor, driven by a primal terror. I heard the captain's snarl of irritation behind me, then a wet, final crunch. I kept running, blind, through the labyrinthine nightmare ship. I found a maintenance hatch, a duct, and crawled into the bowels of the vessel. I hid among the shrieking pipes and pulsating, organic-looking machinery. I hid for what felt like lifetimes. The ship went to battle stations once. The shudder of lance fire and the scream of tearing metal echoed through the hull. We were attacked by whom I never knew. Maybe loyalists, maybe other traitors. In the chaos, amidst the damage alerts and fires, I found an escape pod, a tiny one-person coffin. I punched the ejection sequence without knowing where it would take me. The pod jettisoned, spinning into the silent, cold void. The last thing I saw on the view screen was the purple and gold ship, venting atmosphere from a dozen wounds, drifting away into the star-strewn black. Now I float. My oxygen is low. The nutrient paste in the pod is gone. I record this into the pod's distress beacon, a meaningless howl into the uncaring dark. No one will hear it. Or, if they do, they will be like the captain, or like the loyalists on Valkyria, or like the broken Astartes in the cell. There is no rescue. Only different shades of the same ending. The old woman on Galaspar asked me who we would be when there was no other. I have my answer now. We will be alone. Truly, utterly alone. Because the great, grand project of unity, the crusade to bind all of humanity together, has instead torn it into a million screaming fragments. The Emperor's silence has been replaced by the screams of his children. And his children's rebellion has birthed a new silence, the silence of a galaxy where trust is impossible, where every brother is a potential betrayer, where every truth is a lie waiting to be weaponized. I started this remembering the first silence. I will end in the last one, the silence of my own slowing breath in this metal coffin between the stars. I sought to capture truth, and the final, absolute truth I have learned is this. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, not because there are monsters in the void, but because we, in our desperate search for angels and fathers and perfect truths, became the monsters ourselves. And the war is just the sound we make as we tear each other apart, forever and ever, until the stars themselves go cold. The beacon chirps, indicating the message is complete. There is nothing left to say, nothing but the silence.